The 1980s were not kind to the U.S. domestic auto industry, nor were they kind to its customers. Domestic automakers, as well as foreign competitors, were faced with increasing fuel economy and emission standards that made it challenging to meet those requirements with the type of vehicles that domestic companies were used to producing and, frankly, produced very well, which were big, full-size, rear-wheel drive cars with heavy engines and transmissions. Throughout the 1980s, a number of new engines were developed and introduced for use under hood in U.S. domestic vehicles, and even the old ones were updated to help improve their emissions as well as their fuel economy. By and large, the results of this so-called experiment on the buying public were mixed. There were some engines that performed very well, and that there were some that just simply did not. Let's review now what some of the best and worst engines of this 1980s time period were for domestic auto companies, and hopefully this is a helpful buyer's guide for somebody who's looking to buy a classic, we'll call it, car from this time period. If I forgot anything, feel free to comment below or comment on which of these was your favorite and why. Let's begin with our friends at Mopar and two engines from this era that were quite good. The first is Chrysler's Slant 6 engine, and the second is Chrysler's 318 V8. The Slant 6 engine was introduced by Chrysler in 1959, and it was characterized by its 30-degree off-center inclination of the cylinder block. This was something that was unique for Chrysler, but something that Mercedes had been doing since 1952. And it endowed the engine with an ability to fit under hood in areas where the overall hood height was desired to be less than if the engine were standing tall. By the 1980s, the Slant 6 was commonly found under hood in 225 cubic inch form. It had an undersquare design with a 3.4-inch bore and a 4.125-inch stroke, and it displays, as I said, 225 cubic inches or 3.7 liters. The engine was used in many Chrysler vehicles of the time, everything from Cordobas and Muratas to the M-body vehicles, the Plymouth Grand Fury, Dodge Diplomat, and the Chrysler Fifth Avenue for a few years before it would be sunset in that application as well, and the 318 V8 would be standard. The engine was a great engine and extremely durable, but it did have some funny quirks, one of which is that it didn't get hydraulic valve lifters until the 1981 model year, so it had mechanical valve adjustments all the way from its inception in 1959 through to 1981. These engines were never really all that powerful, and by this point in time, they were making about 100, 110 horsepower and 170 to 180 pound-feet of torque. But one thing was for certain, they were reliable. You could pound on these Slant 6 engines and pound on them, and they just would not die, no matter what you did to them. A little-known fact about the Slant 6 is that in the early 80s, Chrysler actually signed an agreement with Perkins to build a dieselized version of the Slant 6, kind of similar to what Oldsmobile had done with the 350 cubic inch V8 that was introduced for the 1978 model year. I suppose Chrysler thought that diesel V8 was highly successful and popular because the sales, at least in initial years, were very high. And they wanted to capitalize on that trend by dieselizing the Slant 6 and even, allegedly, their 2.2-liter four-cylinder that was found under hood in many of the K-variant cars. Alas, that never came to fruition as the diesel market collapsed, largely because people had such bad experience with Oldsmobile V8 diesels and because diesel fuel prices began to increase throughout the 1980s. But nonetheless, the Slant 6 was just a great engine from Chrysler during this time period, and one, if you find it under hood of your Malaise era Chrysler, you know you've got something good there. The other Malaise era engine that's great to find under hood of your Chrysler is the 318 V8. And again, this just found its way into so many different Chryslers, everything from the R bodies to the M bodies. It was so popular, and it really was a great engine, although by this point not very powerful, kind of making around 130-ish horsepower. The Chrysler 318 was based on the LA family of engines that was introduced in 1964 in 273 cubic inch form. And as a 318, it was obviously a little bit larger than its initial application, but by this point in the 1980s, it really was known for having great durability and reliability. Similar to the Chrysler Super 6 variant of the Slant 6, these 318s were often outfitted with Carter BBD two-barrel carburetors, which did have electronic feedback controls in a number of years, but were still very reliable and pretty simplistic, especially when you compare them with other feedback carburetors that were employed at the time. Of course, many of these 318 V8s did have a variant of Chrysler's lean burn setup with the spark control computer that was attached to the air cleaner. And by this point, it was more reliable and had better drivability than it did back when it was introduced. But it still had, well, some quirks to it. The great news is, though, that these carburetors are easily modified from their lean burn setup to, I'll call it a rich lean burn setup, by simply taking the top off of the carburetor and readjusting the metering rods so they allow in more fuel at part throttle and full throttle applications. It's an adjustment that takes all of about 15 minutes, and the car drives much better and you restore some of the pep. You can also advance the spark timing a fair amount, but be aware you need to check for spark knock on these cars and make sure the EGR valve is working. Otherwise, you'll cause some severe engine damage. And you must check for spark knock after having driven the car on the freeway where the engine is fully warmed up and also the spark control computer has advanced the ignition timing fully. It won't do that if you're just driving around town and opening and closing the throttle position. There is one unfortunate 318 variant that you must be aware of that was found under hood of some Chryslers of this era, and that is the 318 that was fuel injected found under hood of the Imperial from 1981 to 1983. Chrysler engineers were trying to come up with something that was advanced technology for their Imperial, and they devised this fuel injection setup, and actually it was the same engineers that Chrysler employed to help put the man on the moon. These Huntsville, Alabama-based engineers, though, just rushed this overall fuel injection setup to market, and it was highly imperfect. So much so that Chrysler recalled all of the 1981 to 83 Imperials and agreed to retrofit them for customers free of charge with two-barrel carburetors. Now, I will say that if you get an Imperial that's been retrofitted by the dealer, that's the one that you want to get. And you don't want one that was retrofitted by just somebody after the fact. You can tell ones that were retrofitted by the dealer because they'll have the spark control computer as part of the air cleaner. Usually when individuals retrofitted them at independent shops, they wouldn't put the feedback carburetor on there. It would just be a standard two-barrel, or maybe even they changed the intake manifold and put a four-barrel on. So that's one telltale sign that you have a dealer conversion. But the dealer conversion kit didn't just include a new intake as well as a carburetor. It included a new instrument cluster, a new fuel tank, new fuel pumps, and it included about 15 to 20 hours of labor to retrofit all of this stuff on the Imperial and make it work correctly. So those kits were very expensive for Chrysler. Beyond just the overall cost of the components, the 15 to 20 hours labor that it took the dealer to put them in, that's the kind of Imperial that you want if you're going to get something with a Chrysler 318 V8. Now, on the flip side of the spectrum, in terms of worst Chrysler engines during this time period, we have to talk about the Chrysler/Mitsubishi 2.6-liter four-cylinder that, again, found its way under the hood of many K cars as well as minivans. Yes, the Chrysler 2.2-liter and 2.5 in some cases were head gasket blowers, but the 2.6 I think, had more challenges associated with it than either of those Chrysler-designed four-cylinders. This 2.6-liter was designed by Mitsubishi, and it had a number of interesting features for the time. The first was that it actually had a balance shaft. Mitsubishi called it the silent shaft engine, and this helped quell vibrations in what was a very large four-cylinder engine. It also had 3 valves per cylinder. Yes, I said that correctly, 3 valves per cylinder, one of which was a second, very small intake valve that introduced a blast of high-pressure air into the combustion chamber to better help distribute the air-fuel mixture versus what was just coming in through the normal primary valve. That worked, well, okay. And the engine did provide customers with more horsepower as well as torque versus what they were used to with the standard 2.2-liter four-cylinder underhood in their K car, as an example. The 2.2-liter four-cylinder in 1981 made 84 horsepower and 111 pound-feet of torque. By contrast, this Mitsubishi 2.6-liter engine made 92 horsepower, only 8 more than the 2.2, but it made 20 more pound-feet of torque, 131 versus 111. So it did give the vehicles a bit more pep. Unfortunately, the durability associated with these Mitsubishi 2.6 engines isn't great. Some people had good experience with them, but there are a number of weak points, one of which is the Mikuni carb that often has choke problems, and you really can't fix it, especially these days. It's just impossible to get parts. They also seemed to blow their fuel pumps, and you have to replace them maybe every 40 to 50,000 miles. They had head gasket issues. They also had timing chain and tensioner issues. Well, the timing chain, the sprockets, the guides often went bad, and when they did so, you can imagine metal shavings would get into the oil. They might not always be picked up and filtered, and they start circulating through the engine, and then that would kill it. Camshafts would have issues. The heads would crack. They just really were not great engines compared to what I mentioned before, the Slant 6 as well as the 318 from Chrysler. That maybe the worst problem that you're going to have with those vehicles is valve cover gasket leaks or oil leaks, which are pretty easily repaired. It's hard to repair timing chains, sprockets, head gaskets, camshafts, heads, etc. And those were all issues on this Mitsubishi 2.6. On the flip side, I will say that the balance shaft did work, and the Mitsubishi 2.6 is considerably smoother as an engine than, for example, the General Motors Iron Duke that was under hood of many General Motors cars during this era, until at least the Iron Duke got its own version of a balance shaft in 1988. And by the way, that balance shaft was in the oil pan and was a completely different design, in part because Mitsubishi had the patent on balance shafts for 4 cylinders, and General Motors was trying to come up with an alternate way to quell the vibration so that it wouldn't infringe upon Mitsubishi's patent. In any event, hope you enjoyed this special on Best and Worst Mopar engines. Feel free to comment on if you feel I missed any or with your experiences with the motors that I discussed. Thanks again for watching. Till next time, take care.